I'm Forrest Sawyer. We all know their names. John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the son of Sam. Their brutal acts are truly testament to the darkest fringes of human behavior. And yet, when they weren't killing, they led perfectly ordinary lives and offered no clues to the violent psychopath lurking beneath the mask of normalcy. That makes serial killers very hard to catch. But today, investigators are increasingly drawing on state-of-the-art techniques to tie together crimes that once would have never seemed connected. Still, it can be frustrating, as we find in Seattle, in the hunt for the Green River Killer. He's murdered at least 49 people since the early 80s. He may still be at it. But in 1989, as the authorities continued their search, they admitted they made mistakes they'll never make again.
On the 15th of July, 1982, 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield washed up against some old pilings in the slow-moving Green River. She had been strangled. Within a month, the bodies of 4 more young prostitutes had been pulled from the same area. By the end of the summer, police said they were looking for one serial murderer. Until they caught him, his name would be the Green River Killer. The Green River Killer left the bodies of his victims in several heavily wooded spots around Seattle. Dump sites, the police called them. With each discovery, the sites were sealed off and combed for clues by members of a special Green River task force. Because some bodies weren't discovered for years, detectives usually found skeletons. They won't say what else they found. They do say it's just enough evidence to tell them the killings are related. So far, the entire investigation has cost more than $15 million. Why hasn't the killer been captured? The police say it's because of the kind of people who were killed. Of the 49 victims, 24 were last seen along this strip near the airport, a hub for Seattle's young prostitutes.
He knew they were good victims, and nobody would care about them getting off the street. I mean, what's more normal than a guy driving up to a prostitute and saying, you know, hey, I got $20, let's make a deal. She hops in the car and off they go.
Tom and Carol Estes, parents of a Green River victim. The Estes themselves found their daughter's mugshot in the Vice Squad files of known prostitutes under the name Betty Jones.
I called the task force, and I proceeded to get the same story that I had gotten for 2 years. And
Which was what?
They had not made any connection between Debbie and prostitution, and until they do, they weren't in the business of looking for runaways. That was the typical story. And so I told him that I had pulled her picture out of their file. And he said, oh yeah, we've been looking for Betty Jones, you know, since 1982 because nobody's seen her.
Because police had spent 3 years looking for Betty Jones rather than Debbie Estes, they may have lost critical leads about Debbie's last contacts and final movements. In May 1988, workers installing playground equipment dug up her body. The task force confirmed that Debbie was one of 18 girls under the age of 18 murdered by the Green River Killer. Her father believes that law enforcement's response would have been much different had his daughter and the other victims been housewives or college girls.
It's like they don't matter. That this is common trash. And these are children. And this is my girl. And she's not trash.
Major Bob Evans has been head of the Green River Task Force for the last 2 years. Evans and others believe they already have the killer's name in this room. It contains confidential files on at least 18,000 possible suspects, some turned in by anonymous tipsters. Many don't know they're under investigation in the Green River case. Others say when information about them left this room and was released to the public, it ruined their lives.
I can't get a job as a damn dishwasher.
Mel is a former cab driver who says he knew the first 5 Green River victims. In the fall of 1982, he offered to help police with his contacts among the prostitutes.
I got to know the business because I'd let the girls get into the car and warm up and dry out on wet nights.
Sounds like you sort of became a surrogate father to some of these women.
A lot of the girls out there called me Dad.
The police said the guy just seemed to know too much, and the FBI had told them the killer might offer his help. So Mel became the first of 4 prime suspects in an investigation that was suddenly very public.
Undercover officers have been stationed in this area, keeping a 24-hour watch on Melvin, who lives just up the road from here.
They went through property they had no business touching. When they did search the property the second time, they chopped up the floor of the barn. My kids couldn't go to Sunday school with a deacon in his car without the cops being right behind them.
Mel was never arrested or charged in the case, and police later admitted they lost valuable time concentrating on him rather than pursuing other leads. The next major suspect was a part-time fur trapper named Bill McLean. McLean and his wife Faye were on their way home from work when they were picked up in February 1986. While they were being questioned, television crews videotaped the task force searching their home. Bags of clothing and other evidence were carried away. Faye McLean became known as the wife of the Green River Killer. Until now, she's avoided talking about the experience, which she says shattered her life.
Again, I felt violated, humiliated, degraded, and raped.
Investigators justified the search, saying Bill McLean in some ways matched an FBI profile of the killer and was an avid trapper who worked near some of the dump sites. But they filed no charges against Bill or Faye. 1987 brought another suspect, said to resemble a man seen with some victims before they disappeared. This time, the task force withheld the man's name, but again, it failed to link him directly to the killings. The summer of 1988 marked the 6th anniversary of the first Green River killings, and the question in Seattle was, would the killer ever be caught?
The man who murdered these women, the Green River Killer, still doesn't have a face, and he still doesn't have a name. In early 1992, 10 years after the first victim attributed to the Green River Killer was found, the case remained a mystery, and investigators fear the trail has gone cold.
Nobody knows where the Green River Killer is now. There are no number 1 suspects or number 2 suspects where...
For Bob Keppel and other Washington state authorities, it's been a bitter disappointment. After sifting through almost 600 suspects and spending $15 million, they still had not gotten their man. The task force has been cut to 1 full-time detective, and since 1984, official word on the streets of Seattle is that the Green River Killer has stopped killing. But reporter Thomas Guillen has followed the story from the beginning and believes the murderer is still active.
When the killing stopped here, then you found killings in San Diego.
Guillen says that 35 women found murdered in San Diego matched the MO of the Green River Killer. And there's mounting evidence that whoever the killer is, he may be back home. Between 1984 and 1991, 38 more bodies turned up in the Seattle area, mostly young prostitutes and drifters like the first 49. Many left in wooded areas close to the original dump sites. Are those unsolved murders the work of the Green River Killer? FBI agent John Douglas says it's all too possible.
There's no cure for these people. They don't just burn out at all. They'll go on killing if you don't stop them.
When we come back, we'll look at a string of murders in Florida that terrorized a college town and launched a frantic search for another serial killer. In Seattle, police admit that the outcry to catch the Green River Killer might have been greater if the victims had not been prostitutes. But in Gainesville, Florida, in 1990, the victims of a serial killer were not prostitutes, they were college students at the state's flagship school. When 5 bodies were discovered in the space of 3 short days, it touched off a panic and put enormous pressure on the police to come up with a suspect.
Gainesville, Florida, small town, USA. It's a community with one main industry, education. The campus of the University of Florida captures the mood of Gainesville. Friendly, outgoing, serious, and above all, safe. Therefore, it seemed especially cruel that this community was the scene of some of the most horrible murders in memory. A serial killer struck with no warning, leaving the survivors of this quiet little college town facing their gravest moment of crisis. Williamsburg Village Apartment Complex, Gainesville, 3:45 p.m. Sunday, August 26th. It was the day before the fall semester, but amid all the activity, there was a strange silence at apartment 113 of the Williamsburg Village Complex, where messages left for Sonia Larson and Christina Powell by their worried parents went unanswered.
I have two girls. The parents suspect either something's wrong with them or they've disappeared or something. I'm just not sure.
Betty Kernut, the manager on call, rushed to the apartment, where her maintenance man and a police officer broke through the door. Nothing could prepare her for the sight of Sonia Larson's nude, mutilated body lying on her bed.
My mind just automatically shut it off, and I turned around to the deputy sheriff and I said, "This is yours."
The police officer then found the butchered body of Christina Powell in the living room.
That was really the worst scene that I have ever seen.
My maintenance man, unfortunately, ran down the stairs screaming, "Oh God, oh God," and came out and he threw up. And the sad, sad part about it is we had the parents behind us on the stairs.
I need a supervisor, an ID, criminalistics, and detectives to respond down here to this apartment. I'll advise when I get here. I got a double signal 7 here. I believe it's going to be more.
Using the code Signal 7, meaning dead person, Ray Barber urgently radioed for help. Christina Powell's parents waited for the dreadful news to be confirmed.
My job was to stay with the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Powell.
It was to be the toughest job in Officer Ashok Banji's police career, as he too became personally involved in Gainesville's moment of crisis.
I felt like I had lost somebody too, just like they had. And by the end of the evening, it was like I just wanted to lay down and cry for a long, long time.
But even as police worked into the night at the Williamsburg crime scene, across town at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, Gainesville's crisis was spreading. Records Room, Alachua County Sheriff's Office, 12:30 a.m. Monday, August 27th.
It was a Sunday night, and Krista was always 15 minutes early. She was never late. She was always punctual or early.
Kim Norman of the Sheriff's Office was concerned about her workmate and friend, Krista Hoyt, running late for the midnight shift.
So I said, go ahead and call communications and have a deputy sent out there and see if she's okay.
But things were far from okay. The deputy that Kim sent found Krista's body with the same mutilations as the earlier murders. Krista had also been decapitated.
Yeah, I put myself in her shoes every day. And I wonder, did she suffer?
After dealing with the media at the Williamsburg murder scene, Police Information Officer Sadie Darnell had retired for the evening, unaware of just how dark this night had become for her hometown.
I got home and to bed about 2:30, and I got a call from Spencer about 3 in the morning. He's the public information officer for the sheriff's office. He called to let me know about the third body being found, Krista Hoyt.
One of the first things out of my mouth to Sadie was, "Sadie, the big one is here."
By Monday morning, a grim pattern had emerged. All 3 victims were young brunette women. And as that news spread, it provoked shock and panic amongst the tens of thousands of students in Gainesville, whose community seemed to have become a killing field.
It hit us then. We all sat down and watched the newscast, and then we went up to one of my friends' rooms, and we all sat around, and we just cried. And one by one, we all called our parents and talked to them. And as soon as I got on with my dad, I just, I lost it.
Gatorwood Apartments, West Gainesville, 8:08 a.m. Tuesday, August 28th. Early Tuesday morning brought confirmation that Gainesville was being terrorized by a serial killer on a brutal rampage, with students seemingly his only targets. News of the 4th and 5th victims was radioed in here to the Alachua County Sheriff's dispatcher at 8:08 a.m.
Primary Channel 1033, Primary Channel 1033 for the units at Gatorwood Apartment 12 and 3.
We'll seal off that whole complex. We'll start keeping log of anybody coming and going.
The communications supervisor called me and said, "We've got bodies number 4 and 5. At the most, what I expected, if anything, was, that we would have an additional body. To have 2 additional bodies, it was just incredible.
Both victims were stabbed to death. The bloody body of a young woman, Tracy Paulus, was found in her bedroom. Nearby, in his bedroom, the first male victim was found. Manny Taboda, a friendly giant of a man, a 200-pound athlete who died quickly with few signs of a struggle. The media gathered at the murder scene almost as soon as the police, on the trail of what had become the biggest story in Florida. Mark Washburn was the Miami Herald editor assigned to the Gainesville murders.
You've got Jack the Ripper loose at the state's flagship university, and everybody is scared to death and petrified to death, and I think everybody wants to know exactly what is going on.
And on that somber Tuesday morning in Gainesville, it was the media who were to script and play out a tragedy within a tragedy.
The media, which numbered between 50 and 80 different representatives, were becoming frantic for information.
And they said, are the victims so-and-so and so-and-so? I said, please don't run it yet. We're trying to get a hold of next of kin. It's vital that you don't. Too late. It happened. It ran. We understand both sets of families found out via the news media before we had an opportunity to tell them.
Mrs. Ricky Paulus got the news secondhand through the media. She had to tell her husband George, working on a Miami construction site.
She told me it was Tracy. She'd been murdered. I had a 25-mile drive to come home. That was an awful long drive.
Every mile was littered with memories.
Just kept saying, baby, baby, baby. Sick. Can't be.
Gainesville, 7 p.m. Tuesday, August 28th. The broader effect of the events on the entire community of Gainesville was immediate and in its own way just as shocking. Dormitories were packed with those who huddled together for safety. Students armed themselves to the teeth.
There were guys in my dorm carrying baseball bats and golf clubs. We went to use the phone because our phones were out. There was a girl carrying a kitchen knife right next to her.
Gainesville, Friday, August 31st. The killings had stopped, but the pressure on the authorities to break the case was still building.
At this point, we're not sure if an arrest is going to be imminent.
It seems here the young heal easily or forget quickly. Only a few students who fled haven't come back to campus. Their initial outrage and fear has been replaced by an air of normalcy, even though police haven't solved this case and admit the madman may still be in the neighborhood. The loved ones and relatives of those who died try to find some meaning in their suffering.
I learned a lot of values out of it. It's a sad way to learn values, and I'd rather not have ever learned the values in life like this. If you've got something to say it, because you may not ever have a chance to say it again. You know, you tell that person what's on your mind. You know, if you love someone, tell them.
As suddenly as the Gainesville murders began, they stopped. In 1991, almost a year after the grisly events, police arrested a suspect said to be linked to the crime scenes by physical evidence. Danny Rowling was charged with the 5 murders in 1992. Described as a small-time crook with a long jail record, he was already serving life in prison for repeated armed robberies and is awaiting trial on the Gainesville murders.
May these wreaths be an emblem of their zest for life.
Meanwhile, those murdered in and around Gainesville were remembered at a ceremony in August of 1991. As friends and family gathered to celebrate their lives, they waited for some small measure of justice in their deaths.
There's no punishment too severe for this. I mean, because these were totally innocent victims. They did nothing whatsoever to bring this horror upon themselves. They were in the supposed safety of their homes.
Next, we follow the trail of a man who the FBI believes murdered over 100 young women across 5 states. A chilling portrait of the two sides of serial killer Ted Bundy when we return. Murders brought back terrible memories of Ted Bundy, the clean-cut, clever law student who brutally raped and killed at least 36 women, many college students, and many in Florida. Bundy's bizarre story became a textbook case in tracking these horrible crimes.
At the crisis clinic, he would walk me to my car at 4 a.m. and say, Ann, be sure the door is locked because I don't want anything to happen to you on the way home.
I was glad, very glad, that he got the electric chair.
These two women are talking about the same man, Theodore Robert Bundy, perhaps this nation's most heinous criminal. Experts now believe his first victim was 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr, who vanished from her home in nearby Tacoma. Young Ted Bundy, then 15, was the neighborhood paperboy at the time. The methodical killing frenzy began in earnest in early 1974 when young women in the Seattle area began disappearing. All of his victims looked remarkably alike, attractive with long dark hair, between the ages of 16 and 23. Along the murder trail, Bundy became a man of many descriptions and personalities. Arrested in Colorado, he looked dirty and unkempt, like a mountain man. He escaped twice from Colorado prisons. Awaiting trial in Utah, he was a cocky would-be lawyer.
And yes, I intend to complete my legal education and become a lawyer and be a damn good lawyer.
Bundy defended himself in a Miami court for the murders of sorority sisters Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, clubbed to death in their beds at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee.
Murder in the first degree upon one Margaret Bowman. Guilty as charged.
The jury found Bundy guilty, and on July 31st, 1979, he was sentenced to die with a strange postscript from the judge to the nation's #1 killer.
You made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself.
This woman knew an entirely different Ted Bundy. They worked together at a Seattle suicide crisis center, taking phone calls through the night from those in despair. She became a surrogate sister to him when he was a bright, politically active college student in the early 1970s.
What was he like?
He was the perfect young man, empathetic, sympathetic, ambitious, the kind of man that if I had been 10 years younger or my daughter's 10 years older, I would have thought this is the perfect man for a mate for life.
Anne Rule, a former cop herself, is now a prolific crime writer. One of her bestsellers, The Stranger Beside Me, described her relationship with a young man she befriended before the killing spree began. His name, Ted Bundy.
We worked together for a year, 2 nights a week. Very close friends. We stayed close friends for many years.
Why did you suspect he could be the Seattle serial killer as you looked into that case?
Resemblance to the composite picture that was drawn from Girls in the Park. Proximity. I knew where girls had been raped and murdered because of my job, and Ted lived 2 blocks away in many cases. And then coincidences. I knew he sometimes sounded Canadian. I knew he played racquetball. I knew things about him, but then I thought, no, it couldn't be.
Police knew the killer drove a bronze Volkswagen. Anne asked them to check if Bundy owned a Volks. She found out he did.
I was shocked because he had never had a car. I used to take him to parties and bring him home drunk and give him to his landlady because he didn't have a car. I called just to ease my mind, and instead I got the word that, yes, indeed, Ted Bundy is registered with a 1968 bronze Volkswagen Bug.
Even with Anne's hot tip, police had so many suspects, 2,400 on file, Bundy eluded arrest for another 13 months and killed at least 20 more women.
At what point in the ensuing years and as you got into the case did you realize the man who had sat next to you, who was your friend when you were working in the crisis center, could be a serial killer, Ted Bundy?
The absolute point was in July 1979 in a courtroom in Miami when they brought forth the bite mark evidence. I had to see physical evidence, and there was the overlay of Ted Bundy's teeth on the flesh, imprint of the flesh in Lisa Levy's buttocks. And I ran down the hall and got sick because I knew there was no other explanation.
Among the cases Bundy confessed to was that of Denise Naslin, a beautiful 18-year-old. She was picnicking with friends at nearby Lake Sammamish in the summer of '74 when abducted, along with another young woman, Janice Ott. Denise was last seen near this restroom. Bundy lured her to his car on the guise of needing help. He had already abducted Janice Ott. He forced Janice to watch as he murdered Denise and then killed Janice.
Seemed as though there was nothing that Denise couldn't do. She was a very loving girl, very kind, very compassionate. She was everything.
Susan Rancourt was another of Bundy's young victims. Her mother, Vivian, still grieves. In an extraordinary moment, Mrs. Rancourt spoke with Ted Bundy's mother. Both were at home, Mrs. Bundy on the telephone, and Mrs. Rancourt spoke to a camera from Seattle's KOMO TV. They shared their anguish, the mother of the victim and the mother of the executed killer.
I've said it before, and I'm glad to be able to say it directly to one of the moms. We don't know why this happened, and we feel so desperately sorry for you. We didn't want our son to do these things. We have two beautiful daughters of our own, and we know how we would feel. I am sorry.
I know you are. And we don't hold any resentment or hatred towards you or your family.
How can society gain anything from learning from having seen this man?
They can learn that the most vicious killers may look on the outside as wonderful as a movie star. And they can learn to be prepared for the ruse, the device, something from a stranger to lure them away from the crowd. If they are taken away, they must learn to fight. And they must learn to fight in the crowd. Yell, scream, kick. Because the one thing a serial killer does not want is for people to notice him.
The image of the calm, collected, charming Ted Bundy still stands out as a stark portrait of modern-day evil. His story did not end with the conviction in 1979. During the next decade, Bundy was allowed to marry and father a child in prison while he fought the death sentence. The whole process cost the state of Florida more than $6 million. But Bundy finally paid with his life on January 24th, 1989.
I can tell you that Theodore Bundy was executed at 7:16 this morning in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was executed.
The atmosphere outside the prison in Stark, Florida was like a grotesque circus, with college students raucously calling for the violent death of the man who spent his final hours confessing to dozens of killings. Ann Rule, the woman who knew Bundy and later wrote a book about him, became a best-selling author and expert on crime.
We are not looking for the Hunchback of Notre Dame. We're not looking for a drooling, slavering monster.
Rule speaks all over the country, and in 1985 helped the Justice Department set up a national database on serial crimes like Ted Bundy's. The memory of the brutal boy next door remains an unsettling one.
The mask was absolutely perfect. That is one of the frightening things, that you can know someone for as long as I knew Ted and not know what's going on behind that smile and those clear eyes.
When we come back, we'll see how the lessons learned from many of these cases are put into practice as the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit lets us follow the trail of a serial killer. Now that we've seen several cases of that strange breed of serial killers, we're going to take a rare look at an actual investigation. This report from 1991 gained unprecedented access to the elite FBI unit, which spends all of its time studying and stalking people who kill for the thrill of it.
We have a body. They've discovered a body here.
The bodies of the dead women were all dumped in open areas.
Serial murder is the scare crime of the 90s. These murderers are intelligent, with IQs often over 125. They don't stop killing until they're caught. And their victims never know they are the chosen prey until it is too late. Like the 67 young men authorities say were lured into mild-mannered Randy Kraft's car with offers of beer and drugs. Meet G-Man John Douglas, whose elite 12-person unit examines over 1,000 cases of violent crime every year. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. The crack team fictionalized in the movie Silence of the Lambs.
It's like they read the same book
on how to abduct women or children and how to torture women and children or men.
Here they allowed us a rare glimpse of an actual case. The FBI and local police for the first time agreed to open their files on a serial murder investigation in Wilmington, Delaware. Thanksgiving weekend, 1987. State Trooper Joe Swisky is called to a murder scene, the first victim of the man who would come to be known as the Corridor Killer. Ultimately, 5 women would disappear along an 8-mile stretch of US 40, frequented by hitchhikers and prostitutes.
We saw the obvious signs of torture, the hands being bound, and then we saw the duct tape, and we knew that whatever or whoever had done this, it was something we weren't used to dealing with.
June 29, 1988. County police find a dead woman near Wilmington. To Detective Jim Hedrick, it immediately rings a bell. Like the woman 6 months earlier, Catherine DeMoro had been bound and tortured.
A natural fear was that we potentially had a serial killer at that point.
The day after DeMoro's death, state and county forces took what evidence they had to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. And here in this room, Special Agent Steve Mardigian and Jim Zopp sat with Delaware authorities, looking for what they called the signature, clues which characterize this killer and this killer alone.
You can notice on her right wrist there's evidence of bruising around the wrist there. You can notice around her neck there's evidence of some type of device constricted around her neck.
She was tortured.
She was tortured. What's missing from the scene are the devices that caused the injuries that you're looking at.
Then they noted another small detail that would prove critical as Delaware authorities continued their hunt for the Corridor Killer.
As the earlier victim, one of the significant forensic findings at the scene was a multitude of blue fibers covering the body.
Those blue fibers, painstakingly analyzed in the FBI labs, were identical on both of the dead women.
The location of which the bodies were found also, all together suggested the possibility that this person had some involvement in the construction trade.
That first week of July, the FBI drew a picture of the crimes for Delaware authorities. First 2 clues. Blue fibers on both victims indicated they'd been killed in the same place. Torture was the killer's signature. And he would be a construction worker, a he-man type. He would drive a 4-wheel vehicle or van, and based on extensive knowledge of serial crimes, the FBI also told local police.
This individual would be a white male, that he would be between the ages of 25 to 35, that he would live in the area of where these bodies were being found, because that would be what they classified as his comfort zone.
By September of '88, there were 2 victims and 3 more women were missing. The task force knew that it was a race against the clock, with the FBI telling them the killer would strike again, and he would likely change his strategy. He did. The next body was dumped here in the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, naked, with all physical evidence washed away. It was September 21st, and there were still 12 suspects. But that same day, the cops would get the break that would give them their prime suspect, and it was the result of good police work by an eager young rookie. This is Officer Renee Lano, and this is Officer Renee Lano, in the disguise she chose for her part in tracking the Corridor Killer. She began walking the shadowy stretch of highway where the victims had last been seen, wearing a hooker's getup and a hidden microphone. Dozens of men stopped her, and some became suspects. She'd been at it 10 hours a night since July, when finally in September, there was a man in a blue van who was not like any of the others.
So I opened the passenger door. We talked. I basically played the dumb, stoned routine, like I'd been smoking drugs all day and I was pretty wasted.
This is the conversation her hidden mic recorded.
So stoned right now, bro. What's up? You been partying or what? No. You like to have some phone contact when you're talking?
And then through the conversation, I found out he was in the construction trade, the blue van, I saw the blue carpet, and I took into account all these things that I'm looking at, and I'm thinking, I think this guy's involved.
Lano's next challenge was to get a sample of that blue carpet without getting trapped in the van.
And I pretty much just started acting like, that the van and the carpet, and it was like it was a sexual turn-on for me. I was stroking it, rubbing it, and as I was doing that, I was plucking fibers.
Now, with the fibers in hand, she made an excuse and got away from the van. At the lab, the blue fibers were a match for the ones found on Shirley Ellis and Catherine DeMauro, and the man in the blue van also bore an uncanny resemblance to the profile the FBI had drawn. Stephen Pennell, 31 years old, an electrician who worked construction jobs. As predicted, he was married. He lived in this trailer park within the so-called comfort zone where he killed. November 29, 1988. Stephen Pennell is arrested as the corridor killer. 1 year to the day the first victim was found. Armed with search warrants, authorities found more incriminating evidence. In the van, the blue carpet, stained with Catherine DeMauro's blood. They also found pliers consistent with the victim's wounds, bindings of wire and duct tape, and a sex film with torture as its theme. Stephen Pennell maintains his innocence. He believes the FBI was out to get him and calls it 2.5 years of injustice. He declined repeated requests for an interview.
No doubt about that. He's responsible for the crime. We got the right guy here, and that this was one thorough investigation.
The difficult case of Stephen Pennell was a triumph for the FBI and local authorities who worked to bring him to justice. Pennell was found guilty in the cases where blue carpet samples were found. He was recharged with the third murder and indicted on a fourth. Although he continued to maintain his innocence, he asked that his sentence be carried out to spare his family further anguish.
That the enormity of these two crimes, their cold premeditation, and their callous execution clearly outweigh any mitigating factors.
And so, on March 14th, 1992, serial killer Stephen Pennell became the first person executed in Delaware in 46 years.
If someone took your kid and mutilated them and tortured them and beat them, and she died of fright, you tell me you don't deserve to die. You deserved it.
When we come back, we'll look at the challenge for law enforcement in the future as the Justice Files continues. Despite all the progress, we still have a long way to go. The FBI estimates there are at least 50 serial killers at large in the United States, and keeping up with them remains a formidable challenge.
If you don't identify the serial killer in law enforcement at 23 to 25 years of age, when they are making mistakes initially with their first kills, they're going to go on killing until you see some of the numbers we have today well up into the 30s.
John Douglas is still chief of the FBI's Investigative Support Unit at the National Center for the Study of Violent Crime. He served as technical advisor on the film The Silence of the Lambs, and in 1992 was consulting with police departments across the U.S. and Canada on 12 real-life serial crimes.
What we generally deal with in a serial killer is an experimenter and a very, very adaptive person. He becomes very, very creative. So his creativity is torture.
Drugging, keeping skulls in locker, cannibalism, posing people who are dead that he killed for pictures, masturbating all over the place. This is Jeffrey Dahmer.
In late 1991, the bizarre serial killing spree of Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee once again shocked the nation. It underscored what FBI experts say is needed: even better cooperation among investigators across the country.
Serial killers are difficult to catch primarily because we have over 17,000 law enforcement agencies that do not necessarily communicate with one another.
VICAP, short for the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, is the big hope for the future. This database of crime scenes, victim descriptions, and killers' methods has been in operation since 1985. Local agencies can enter information about homicides in their areas, and every morning, the FBI prints out the 10 most closely related cases. While some police departments have made it policy to submit cases, nothing so far requires local authorities to share information. And in 1991, of the 7,000 unsolved murders in the U.S., VICAP got only 1,500. Douglas and his colleagues aim to improve that number and turn this into a major weapon in the battle to bring serial killers to justice. Our legal expert, Professor Arthur Miller of the Harvard University Law School, calls it a criminal justice success story.
This is one of the few success stories we can talk about in the fight against crime. A real improvement in investigative techniques that's bringing some terrifying killers to justice. Serial killers are not traditional criminals, so they're hard to identify. But as we've seen, the FBI has developed enormously sophisticated psychological profiles and new ways of linking seemingly disparate crimes. The result has been the identification of a whole spate of serial crimes that we might never have linked before. So we're getting better at catching these criminals. But are we going to stamp out serial crime? In truth, probably not. There's something deep in the psyche of the serial killer that we may never be able to understand fully.
I'm Forrest Sawyer. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of the Justice Files.